Somewhere in the mountains between France and Spain lives a people who do not fit. A linguist sitting down with Euskara for the first time finds no handholds, no cognates, no familiar roots, nothing that connects to any other language on earth. Every language spoken across the continent today traces back to a single ancestral tongue, every language except one. Then there is the blood. RH, negative frequencies, so far above the European average, they break the pattern entirely. For centuries, every explanation offered for who the Basques really were turned out to be wrong. We fed every ancient DNA study, every linguistic analysis, every population genetics paper into Grok AI. The picture that emerged did not simplify the mystery. It made it stranger. This is the story of a people who refused to disappear, and what the science finally revealed about how they managed it. Start with the simplest version of the problem. Every language spoken in Europe today, from French to German to Russian to Greek, if you trace it back far enough, descends from a single ancestral tongue: Proto-Indo-European. A language spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe thousands of years ago that spread, fragmented, and eventually became the entire linguistic landscape of a continent. The ancestor is not controversial. Linguists have reconstructed it for more than 2 centuries, building it backwards from the patterns that repeat across the languages descended from it. The family tree is well mapped. The branches are well understood. Then there is Euskara. The Basque language does not belong to that family. It does not belong to any family. It stands completely alone, with no known relatives, living or dead, no ancestor language that linguists can identify, no connection to anything else that has ever been spoken on this planet. That is not a small anomaly. That is a linguistic impossibility that somehow kept happening anyway. The details make it stranger. Euskara contains no meaningful Latin borrowings, despite the Romans occupying the region for centuries and absorbing virtually every other culture they touched. Where Gaulish collapsed into French, where Iberian dissolved into Spanish, where Celtic tongues across the continent were rewritten by Latin vocabulary, Euskara simply did not take the loanwords. The Romans came, stayed, built roads, left, and the language barely shifted. That alone is difficult to explain. Languages do not hold that kind of line against an occupying empire without something unusual holding them. The counting system runs in base 20 rather than base 10, suggesting a mathematical framework that developed in complete isolation from the numerical thinking that organized the rest of the ancient world. Numbers are not built this way without a long stretch of independent development, and certain Basque words, hates for rock, ur for water, su for fire, are so structurally primitive that linguists believe they may represent some of the oldest surviving vocabulary in any living human language. Not old in the sense of medieval or classical, old in the sense of possibly reaching back into the Paleolithic itself. A language this resistant is not resistant by accident. It does not yield. It does not offer handholds. Nothing about it reminds you of anything you already know, because there is nothing else in the world it has ever been connected to. That is the first real clue in the mystery. A language that refuses to cooperate with every other language on the continent is refusing for a reason. And that reason, it turns out, runs deeper than linguistics. The linguistic mystery was strange enough on its own. Then researchers looked at the blood, and the argument got considerably more complicated. In the 1940s, medical teams studying Basque populations made a discovery that nobody had a clean explanation for. The Basques carried the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood of any population on Earth. Depending on the specific community studied, the figure ran as high as 47%. The European average sits around 15%. They also showed unusually high rates of typo blood, creating a combined genetic profile that had no real parallel anywhere else on the continent. Medically, it was an anomaly that required attention. Scientifically, it was a signal pointing at something the researchers could not yet name. Here's why that mattered beyond the purely medical. Rh-negative blood frequency is not stable across mixing populations. When distinct populations intermarry and integrate over generations, Rh-negative rates tend to drop steadily toward a regional mean. That is how blood group genetics behaves almost everywhere you look. A population holding a rare trait at elevated concentrations is a population that has not been absorbing outsiders. The trait is fragile in the face of admixture, which is exactly what makes its persistence informative. The fact that Basque populations had held these concentrations so far above everything around them pointed in one direction only. They had not been mixing. Not recently, and possibly not for a very long time. Whatever had been happening inside the Pyrenees for generations was not the pattern that had shaped the rest of Europe. What the blood studies could not tell you is why. Two competing theories immediately emerged and immediately stalled. Either the Basques were the remnant descendants of Europe's original pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, a population that had occupied the continent before farming arrived and simply never absorbed the waves of newcomers that followed. Or they were migrants from somewhere unknown, arriving in the Pyrenees from an origin point that left no obvious trace, becoming isolated after the fact rather than before it. Both arguments had something going for them. The remnant theory matched the blood group outlier pattern. The migration theory matched the orphan language. Neither had enough evidence to close the debate. The tools required to settle it simply did not exist yet. You could measure a blood frequency. You could not read a population backwards across millennia. You could count the Rh-negative Basques. You could not follow them home. For decades, the Basques remained exactly what they had always been. A question that kept returning. An answer that kept retreating. The science would have to catch up to the anomaly, and eventually, it did. Then the age of ancient DNA arrived, and everything changed direction at once. In 2021, an international team led by Dr. David Comas at the University of Barcelona published what remains the most comprehensive genetic analysis of Basque populations ever conducted. The scale of the study is worth pausing on. 600,000 genetic markers, 200 Basque individuals selected specifically because all four of their grandparents were born in the same microgeographical areas, a filter designed to capture the deepest possible ancestral signal rather than the noise of modern mobility. Nearly 2,000 comparison individuals drawn from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The methodology was designed to be definitive. The results were. What they found was not what the exotic migration theory had predicted. There was no mysterious outside ancestry arriving from an unknown origin point. No ghost population, no vanished civilization depositing its genetics into the Pyrenees and quietly disappearing from the record. The second theory, the one that had held half the debate for decades, simply did not survive contact with the data. What the data showed instead was something in some ways more remarkable. Continuity. Extraordinary, almost unbroken continuity, stretching back over 2,500 years to the Iron Age. Here is the detail that stops you when you first read it. Basque genetic profiles from Iron Age burials are virtually indistinguishable from modern Basque populations. Not similar, not related, indistinguishable. A population living in the Pyrenees 2,500 years ago carried the same genetic signature that is flowing through the veins of someone walking through Bilbao or Bayonne today. To understand how rare that is, you have to see it against the rest of the continent. Most European populations show dramatic genetic transformation over just a few centuries as migration and conquest do their inevitable work. The average Spaniard today carries ancestry traceable to at least 6 distinct major population groups: Romans, Visigoths, Moors, earlier Iberian farmers, steppe migrants, others moving through across millennia, every one of them leaving a genetic deposit in the population they passed through. The Basques absorbed almost none of it. While the entire genetic landscape of Europe was being rewritten around them, century after century they remained essentially unchanged. Dr. Comas described the findings as unlike anything previously documented in Europe. That is not casual scientific understatement. That is a researcher who has spent a career studying human genetic variation telling you that what he found had no real precedent on the continent. The Basques were not migrants from somewhere strange. They were the original population, still there, still themselves. The mystery was not where they came from, it was how they managed to stay. The continuity finding was remarkable enough on its own. Then the researchers looked more carefully at the internal patterns within the Basque population itself, and the picture became something genuinely unexpected. The genetic isolation did not happen passively. It was not simply a matter of mountains and geography creating natural barriers that kept outside populations at a distance. The Pyrenees are real, but they are not the Himalayas. People crossed them regularly throughout history. Trade moved through them. Armies moved through them. Pilgrims, merchants, refugees, soldiers, all of them passed through the passes for thousands of years. Geography alone cannot explain a population that stayed genetically closed while the rest of Europe was being rewritten around it. What the data revealed was that the primary mechanism preserving Basque genetic distinctiveness was not geography at all. It was language. The correlation was precise enough to be startling. Communities where Euskara had been continuously spoken showed the strongest genetic isolation. Regions where the language had historically been present but gradually lost showed intermediate patterns, a measurable blurring at the edges where Euskara had receded. Territories where Euskara had never been spoken showed substantially more mixing with surrounding populations. The language boundary and the genetic boundary were effectively the same boundary. Where the language held, the genes held. Where the language faded, the genes faded with it. The granular detail goes further. Different Basque dialects correlated with distinct genetic subdivisions within the population. Researchers could predict with meaningful accuracy which dialect a person spoke based on their DNA profile alone. Communities separated by 15 kilometers showed genetic differences that would be unremarkable between populations on opposite sides of a continent. Take the Roncal Valley in Navarre, a community of shepherds speaking their own distinct variant of Euskara, whose genetic patterns had remained stable for over 1,000 years. The valley was not sealed off from the world. People traded, traveled, left, returned. But they married within the language. Marriage records from the 16th century show that more than 90% of Basques married within their own dialect group. Not just the same language, the same specific variant of it, same village cluster, same valley, same tongue as it was spoken on their particular slope of the mountain. Euskara was not a symptom of Basque isolation, it was the mechanism. A shared language created a social world that outsiders could not enter without first crossing a barrier that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with communication, identity, and daily life. The language was the wall, and for 2,000 years, it held. Pull back from the genetic detail for a moment and consider what this actually means in European terms. Europe, as most people understand it genetically, is a palimpsest, layer written over layer over layer. Anatolian farmers arriving 8,000 years ago and gradually displacing the original hunter-gatherers who had lived on the continent since the last ice age. Steppe pastoralists sweeping in from the east during the Bronze Age and reshaping the genetic landscape of virtually the entire continent in a few thousand years. Romans moving north and west with their legions and their administrative networks. Germanic tribes pushing into the spaces the Romans left behind. Slavic expansions reshaping the east. The slow churn of medieval migration, the movements of the Moors, the Normans, the Magyars, the Vikings, doing their patient work across centuries. On top of all of that, the European gene pool as it exists today is the product of repeated overwriting. Each wave deposited its signature mixed with what was already there and was then partially overwritten by the wave that came after. The original text, the genetic signature of Europe before the Great Migrations began, is almost entirely gone. Almost entirely. The Basques represent what geneticists formally call a genetic refuge. A population that absorbed so little of the successive migration waves that reshaped everything around them that their genome still carries the signature of Europe before the overwriting began. The rest of the continent has been rewritten. The Basques have been preserved. When researchers compare modern Basque DNA against ancient European samples predating the Great Bronze Age population movements, the resemblance is striking in a way it simply is not for any other living population on the continent. Other Europeans carry scattered traces of those older populations, fragments, echoes, percentages that rise and fall depending on the region. The Basques carry something closer to a coherent signal, a genetic profile that matches what the continent looked like before the Yamnaya horsemen ever crossed into the Carpathian Basin. When you look at a Basque person today, you are looking in a measurable biological sense further back into European prehistory than almost anywhere else it is possible to look. Not metaphorically, not in some vague ancestral sense. Biologically, the blood, the bones, the genome itself. That is what a genetic refuge actually is. Not a population that escaped history. A population that absorbed history at a fraction of the rate everywhere else did and carried the older layers forward, intact into the present. The genetics tell one version of the story. The cultural evidence, it turns out, tells exactly the same version from a completely different direction. The cultural evidence reinforces the genetic story at every level. The Basque inheritance system, known as the Exia, concentrated property within single-family lines across generations. Land and house passed forward intact, rather than being fragmented through division, which meant marriages that brought outside families into the property structure were actively discouraged by the economics of the system itself. Marrying within the community was not just a cultural preference, it was the path of least resistance through an inheritance framework that had been shaping Basque family life for centuries. Basque women held property rights and social freedoms that were essentially unheard of elsewhere in medieval Europe. They could inherit, own, manage, and transfer property in their own names at a time when women across most of the continent could do none of those things. That autonomy meant they married within their communities by choice, rather than being traded outward by necessity, the way noble daughters were routinely moved between territories across feudal Europe. A Basque woman with property did not need to leave her valley to secure her future. Their mythology features ancient earth goddesses predating any Indo-European religious framework. Mari, the central figure of traditional Basque cosmology, belongs to a much older stratum of European spiritual life than the pantheons brought in by later migrations. These are not colorful folklore details. They are corroborating testimony from a completely different category of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. Something here was preserved that everywhere else was lost. Then there is the deeper point the evidence forces you toward. The Pyrenees did not save the Basques. That is the comfortable geographic explanation, and the data does not support it. Plenty of populations lived behind more formidable natural barriers and were still genetically transformed beyond recognition within a few centuries. Mountains slow armies. They do not stop ideas, traders, or the slow gravitational pull of neighboring cultures across generations. What the evidence points toward is something harder to explain. Collective will. A community that made, generation after generation, the decision to remain itself, to marry within the language, to pass property through established lines, to teach children a tongue that had no practical advantage outside the valleys, to maintain traditions dense enough and self-contained enough that outside influence simply found no easy entry point. The practical dimension turns all of this into something unexpected. Because Basque populations represent such an unusually unmixed genetic baseline, they have become genuinely valuable to disease researchers trying to understand human biology before centuries of admixture complicated the picture. Their isolation, which looked for so long like a curiosity, turned out to be a scientific resource. Return to where we began, the impossible language, the blood that refused to mix, the people who do not fit. The DNA did not solve the Basques. It confirmed that the mystery was always real. What the genetics added was not a simple answer, but something more valuable. Proof that a people can remain measurably themselves across 2,000 years of pressure, invasion, and transformation happening on every side. Not by accident, not by geography, by choosing to, continuously, across hundreds of generations. That is what makes them extraordinary, not that they survived. Plenty of cultures survived in some diluted form. The Basques survived intact, a living thread reaching back to a Europe that exists nowhere else, still speaking the impossible language, still carrying the impossible blood, still themselves. The question is how much longer the thread can hold, and what we lose the day it finally breaks.